So good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Centre for Cities and Arup, I'd like to welcome you to the launch of Urban Voices, our inaugural survey of UK city leaders. The survey tries to gather the views and the priorities and the aspirations of our UK city and the leaders of our UK cities. Tries to get them to think about not only the here and the now, what they're currently preoccupied with and the issues that matter them on a daily basis, but also, in a sense, how they see their places evolving and changes over time. And we wanted to do this survey for a couple of reasons, but one of the reasons I think particularly is that often the urban voice is often missing, or at least very badly represented in many national conversations. It happens often on the political stage, and discussions that are happening in Westminster this afternoon and started yesterday, I think, are a good illustration of that. In a sense, the urban voice has been completely missing from those sorts of conversations beforehand and during. But it's not just politicians and the political that misses that. It's often the way that the media thinks about and represents our urban as well. And if you kind of think about how that compares to sometimes you hear other voices that are expressed very well, I think the urban voice is often missing on that. So this is the first reason why we wanted to do the survey of our UK leaders, to bring together and actually try to magnify the voice of our urban leaders up and down the country. The second reason is that we often say, and it's right, that we often say when we look at our cities, they are quite a diverse bunch. And that's an obvious statement, but if you're looking at different places across the country, they are quite different to each other. And yet, when you ask their leaders the issues that are on their mind in the short term and indeed in the long term, there is a lot of commonality between them. Whether you're asking the leaders of London or Bristol or Glasgow or other places across the country, there is a lot of commonality on the issues that they are thinking about and the things that they would like more of, particularly from government. So those are the kind of two, many other reasons, but those are two of the primary reasons that we wanted to do the survey, to magnify the urban voice and to show the commonality of agenda that our diverse urban areas have. So that's enough for me. So just give you a sense as to how we're going to run it. In a moment, I'm going to ask Joanna Rao, who's a director of Arup and worked with us on the survey, to come up and say and just talk us through some of the survey findings, particularly how they relate to some of the policy areas that we explored in the survey. And then following Joanna, Susan Aitken, who's the leader of Glasgow City Council, is going to come up and say a few words from a Glasgow perspective and maybe from a Scottish perspective of how she sees the urban voice playing out in that context. And then Peter John, who's leader of Southwark Council and the chair of London Councils, will follow on from Susan and say a few words from his perspective about the urban voice and the need for it. So, without further ado, Joanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you so much, everybody, for coming and listening to what we're going to say about the survey. But actually, I would like to firstly thank Centre for Cities for all their hard work on this survey with us. We've been working with Centre for Cities on a number of different projects over a number of years, including the What Works Centre for Local Economic Growth, and we had a mayoral round table with mayors from the UK and the USA about a year ago, actually this month, to start to understand what some of the big key issues are across the countries. And actually we decided therefore that this survey was going to be a really important moment for us to dig a bit deeper into, as Andrew said, the commonality between issues that we're seeing in places that are very distinct and are very different from one another. So that was my slightly long thank you to Centre for Cities and their fantastic team for working with us so hard on this survey over the last number of months. We'd also like to thank Boston University. They set up the first Menino survey back in the USA a number of years ago and were part of the inspiration and worked very hard with us, providing help and advice on the structure of the questions that we would ask and those things that we would get the most benefit from knowing. So thanks to them, although we didn't fly them over the pond to see us. The survey's been a really interesting part of the work that Arup do alongside our partners Centre for City. Arup's DNA, if you like, is really in city making and the way in which we can address both challenges and opportunities. And we're really, 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 really keen at Arup to make sure that the projects that we work on and deliver provide long-term, sustained, equitable growth for people from all parts of society, businesses and communities. So for us to be able to listen to the voices of those across the UK have been really interesting to us. So I'm just going to reflect on a couple of things from the survey. You have it in front of you as well, and I can see you flicking through now, so I won't say too much because it's a really good read. But unprompted, city leaders did cite housing, regeneration and infrastructure and skills as the big findings, and you kind of think, well, that's probably quite obvious for us to understand that in this room. We know that housing is a problem, we know that infrastructure needs more funding, but actually when we dug under the core of those responses, you know, it's an increase in housing supply and affordable housing, and the ability to be able to deliver all types of housing in cities. That's a really important part of the research that we found. So homes for families as well as homes for those who are new to the market. Air quality and climate change. We decided to ask some questions on this, and actually within this, you know, half the respondents saw that modal shift is a priority in transport, so linking issues together. But 80% of the respondents agreed that they would sacrifice some revenue spending to address the really important moments in climate change that we face. And actually that was compared to 68% in the USA, so we are trying to lead the charge when it comes to climate change and climate mitigation. And just finally on funding, people want longer funding periods, and that's something I've heard for many years. I used to work for the Mayor of London, but the devolution agenda has started to go some way in addressing that, but we're hearing that cities want to have more devolved funds and longer term funding streams to really make an impact in their places. So I will finish there because I'd much rather hear from the leaders and those who are making the decisions. So thank you so much for coming. Thanks, Central Cities.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure, and it was a very nice surprise to be asked to speak here tonight, partly because I've only been a city leader for 18 months, and I'm sure there are people in this room who have far more experience than I do, and I'm a little bit fearful of teaching my granny to suck eggs, so I'm going to try and avoid doing that. But also because I think I might have been asked to speak because I complained about the survey, and I don't want to start on a negative note, because having read the report, I do think it really is a very substantial and very important piece of work. But I complained because devolution means something different to me and to my fellow city leaders in Scotland, and I felt that that wasn't reflected in the survey. But I don't need to carry on being negative, because then, having seen the outcomes of the survey, it's very clear that the strategic priorities that city leaders across the UK have, regardless of their particular situation and their particular set of powers or the particular kind of policy structure that they're working within, are extremely similar, and that they have a very clear sense of where they want to invest and indeed why. And the same things were coming up, and I would have identified exactly those same priorities in my response to the survey. And we are sharing those challenges across the cities, whether it is in social housing, regeneration, employability and skills, closing the educational attainment gap, overseeing city deals for some of us, for the lucky ones. The focus is always on improving lives, on regenerating and enhancing neighbourhoods and places where people live, and reducing generational inequalities. And I think that that is something that is shared right across cities, and it is, although it is not uniquely an urban agenda, it should be an agenda for everyone. It is an agenda on which cities have to lead, because we have the bigger challenges. When it comes to scale, our challenges are greater, and therefore we have the opportunities to demonstrate and to show the way forward on how we use public investment, on how we use economic growth in a way that is sustainable, that is equitable, that does drive down inequalities, that does focus on improving life chances for all of our communities. If there were a couple of things that I thought perhaps were missing that I would pick out, which perhaps are particular priorities for us in Glasgow. One was culture, leisure and sport. I believe it's measured slightly differently, but we believe that we are the single local authority with the highest culture spend in the UK. We have, as a post-industrial Victorian city, inherited, not always helpfully, it has to be said, we've got a lot of old mouldering Victorian glass houses which are much loved by the population, but frankly right at the end of their sell-by date as buildings, and I'm not sure that we really need that fashion of visiting species brought from darkest Africa anymore now they've got the internet, but it was very fashionable in the time when Glasgow was being built. But we have a cultural wealth in Glasgow which is quite extraordinary, actually, one of the most visited museums in the UK outside of London. It is a challenge for us to maintain those. We have maintained them, we have been able to not shut libraries, for example, but we see those very much as drivers for tackling inequality, for improving healthy life expectancy, a huge challenge for Glasgow, for growing skills, for being community assets. And I suppose that was the other thing that is an enormous priority for us that I would want to pick up on, and I suppose is captured across a lot of those other priorities, but it's maybe difficult to pick up on in terms of how do you invest in this exactly. It's perhaps more about how you use the powers and the money that you've got, and that's community empowerment. It is devolution in the closest sense of us as local authorities, as city authorities, being willing to let go and give up some of our powers and indeed resource to the communities that we serve, whether that's through participatory budgeting, local priority setting, enabling them to grow their capacity and resilience to take ownership of both the problems and the solutions to them in their own areas, particularly in our most deprived areas. That's as much a cultural shift as it is about resource and actual strategic powers, but it does require resource, there's no question, and it's very difficult to say we're going to devolve X amount down to every single local community when your parks department or your education department are trying to cling on to every single penny that they've got. So that does take a bit of courage. I suppose I should touch on a relationship with government in Scotland, and I think that was perhaps why I complained a little bit, because when I talk about my relationship with government, and I full disclosure, I'm of the same party as the Party of Government in Scotland, but I do believe actually that my fellow city and indeed local authority leaders of different parties would largely concur that our relationship with government in Scotland is largely one of partnership. It is very accessible, it is open, there is a conversation to be had. That does not mean that there aren't tensions, that there aren't competing priorities, that there aren't outright disagreements, particularly in a period of limited resource. But it is different. So when I say that I have an open and positive relationship with government, it's not the same government that most of you are talking about. And can I just say that in the relatively limited experience I have of working with that particular government, I wouldn't say the same. I think, though, there is a real similarity between Scotland and the rest of the UK, in that historically that distinct role of cities hasn't really been recognised in policy or in resource distribution. In Scotland, we've always been very good at recognising, rightly so, the challenges of extreme remoteness and rurality, of which we have a lot, but not of urbanity. Our resource distribution formula for local authorities doesn't really recognise that. I think, though, we are at the moment pushing at an open door with Scottish ministers. There is a local governance review being conducted in Scotland just now, and just on Friday afternoon, the Scottish Cities Alliance, which is funded and supported by the Scottish Government, Scotland's 7 cities, very diverse 4 city authorities. Glasgow, the only metropolitan regional authority in Glasgow, in Scotland, the only one that could be classified as that, but also 3 cities who sit within much bigger geographical authorities with large rural hinterlands. But we come together in the Scottish Cities Alliance We meet regularly with ministers, and they are giving us the space to have the conversation constructively, to make the case for cities as the engines of economic growth and the engines of tackling inequality, of driving forward equity across society. It is up to us ultimately as the city leaders to make that case, to make it based on evidence, not on complaining, not on carping. That isn't going to move us forward, but to demonstrate the evidence that when our cities do well, and I would say in particular when Metropolitan Glasgow does well, then Scotland does well, and we need the strategic resource, the strategic powers and the revenue raising powers at local level to maximise that economic impact. So there's two aspects of leadership, I suppose, one in our own cities, doing the jobs that we do day to day, one as the leaders of cities on a national level leading that conversation. But also we all have, and increasingly, there isn't going to be an end to austerity anytime soon, regardless of what's claimed. The resource available for public services is not going to grow in the immediate future. I'm only going to mention it once, but Brexit, whatever form it takes, and it seems it's changing daily, is not going to help that situation. I can say that unequivocally, coming from Glasgow, where we had a very strong Remain vote. So our key for delivering the levels of public service, the levels of employability, of bringing new jobs for our people has to lie in economic growth. We're not going to be getting more money from government, we're not going to be getting exponential resource. So we need to focus on growing our city economies, our employment markets, our local tax bases, our skills levels. All of those are absolutely crucial, and those came through, I think, very strongly in the priorities that the leaders identified in the survey. But I think there's a challenge for us in there as well, and it is always to ask that question: what kind of growth and who is it benefiting? Because growth that doesn't reach our most deprived communities and doesn't offer life choices and life chances for our poorest children maybe is growth that we should be very hesitant about and even have the courage to say no to. We always need to be asking the questions: is that rush to build new homes potentially pricing people out of our most vibrant neighbourhoods in our cities? Is encouraging rapid population growth risking a reduction in the standards and quality of the homes that we build? And I'll just mention in passing Grenfell as perhaps one of the lessons. That's one of the lessons that we have to take there. Are the new growth sector jobs that we are attracting accessible to the people in the communities who are most in need of accessing those jobs and of the social mobility and the life opportunities that they provide? And I think we need to, as leaders, both on a local and a national scale, have the courage to ensure that as we are all beavering away to attract investment and development and innovation, we don't lose sight of those fundamentals. And as I say, occasionally leadership will perhaps require us to say to an investor or a developer, actually, do you know what? You're not enhancing quality of life or quality of environment in our city. You're not matching with the strategic priorities that we have set for our people, with the standards that we have set, and therefore actually you're not for us. This isn't the city for you, and unless you're prepared to live up to our standards, maybe we have to let go of you and accept that you'll go to one of our rivals. That is difficult. It's extremely difficult with all of the pressures that we face to turn down potential revenue. But if it's revenue that might actually work counter to the aims, the social justice aims that we want to achieve, then we have to think very carefully about it. I'm very conscious of time, so I absolutely didn't want to list a lot of things that we're doing this in Glasgow. But just very briefly, perhaps some of the things that we've tried to do to set those standards and to send a very strong message in terms of the kind of economic growth that we want. in the city. Standards in housing are absolutely crucial. I am in a very lucky position of having a very significant affordable housing grant from the Scottish Government. My challenge is to spend it quickly enough. Development ready for development in the city, going through planning permission. I have to have that spent within the Scottish parliamentary term, which finishes in 2021. So that's 10,000 affordable homes, of which 7,500 will be social rented. But we are absolutely clear that we will be building new communities that are mixed tenure, that are tenure blind, where nobody knows whether you rent your home from a housing association or from a private landlord, or we'll hopefully minimise that second one, or whether you own your home, because it doesn't matter, and because the standard of your home, the Glasgow standard that we have set and put out for accessibility, for longevity of tenure as people go through their lives, for environmental sustainability, that if you don't match up to that, you won't be building homes in Glasgow. That is, again, takes a bit of boldness, and I have to pay credit to our housing officers who have developed that, but we think that that's absolutely essential, and that will be what makes us more attractive as a city in future, that will build vibrancy and attractiveness into our neighbourhoods. We just attracted Scotland's biggest ever inward investment to Glasgow, Barclays, moving into a part of the banks of the River Clyde, which have been frankly a dead zone for years. We have, through our city deal, invested £60 million in fixing the quay walls under the River Clyde. There were sections of the banks that were undevelopable, that's too hard to say, because they weren't stable, basically. Barclays are going to build there, they are going to bring over 5,000 jobs to the city region. We are delighted with that, it is absolutely brilliant. But we insisted, and I have to say Barclays were brilliant in their response. About 350 of those jobs are ring-fenced, and they will be ring-fenced for people from the most deprived postcode areas of the city region, or people with disabilities, and the two very often go hand in hand. It's now our job as a city and with our surrounding local authorities to make sure that we've got the pipelines to ensure, the skills pipelines to ensure that those people are able to get those jobs. And those are high value jobs, they're not minimum wage jobs, we were insistent on that. Our life sciences sector in Glasgow is absolutely cutting edge. The Imaging Centre of Excellence, the Centre for Stratified Medicine, Glasgow University, leading at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. The point I make there is that because of the conversations we're having as a city region, the academics who are leading that are actively looking at how they can build non-graduate routes into employment in that crucial growth sector, so that people coming through colleges or coming directly from school will have access to that sector where there are going to be high value jobs into the future. So just a couple of very brief examples of how we can use what we've got to begin with to ensure that the economic growth that we're focused on does enhance our communities, improve healthy life expectancy, reduce inequalities, create better life chances. What I want from my government in Scotland and the UK government for all cities is the tools to make sure that all of us can make all of those priorities join up for the people that we represent in our cities, the communities which have the greatest challenges, but actually for the entire country, because cities will set the standard and set the way forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew, and thank you, Susan. That was really interesting, and I was changing what I was going to say, making notes as we were going through, because I thought, well, there are differences, but so much is the same. And actually, the Glasgow housing standards sound remarkably similar to our aspiration in Southwark, where I want you to walk through the borough and not know what tenure of housing you're looking at. I think that is so critical. And there are things that we have to learn from each other. I mean, the Glasgow model has been constantly referenced in the last year in relation to youth violence and how we tackle youth violence through a whole person public health approach. So there's so much that urban areas and cities can learn from each other. And I think this survey kind of underlines the importance of cities talking to each other and sharing their best practice and sharing their aspirations. This is a very timely survey because, at least south of the border, we are in the period ahead of the fair funding review, the government's fair funding review. Fair for who, you might ask? And we and other urban areas are saying, yeah, exactly, fair for who? Because there is a real danger we see in not only in London but in other cities and urban areas around England, that it will be a review of local government finance which takes funding away from cities and densely populated areas. At the moment, there is obviously the way in which finance is distributed is based largely on population and deprivation. We think that's the right approach. But when you're a Conservative government which doesn't have a stronghold or base in London or other metropolitan areas, there is an attraction in looking at other approaches to how you fund local government, including the mileage of roads that you have in a particular area, the sparsity of population. And I think that there, at the moment, the challenge for us in London and other city areas, as the government goes into the Fair Funding Review and Comprehensive Spending Review, indeed, is to make sure that our voice is heard as loudly and as clearly as the counties will be making their case to the government. Having said that, I think it's important to recognise the challenge that we do face in local government and why so many of our challenges, particularly in cities, are the same. Over the last decade, councils in England and Wales will have lost 63% of their government grant, 63 pence in every pound of government grant, which is a massive amount. Local government has three sources of income. In 2010, the largest source of that was government grant, we lost 63% of that, council tax and business rates. And obviously the government has been moving gradually to a system whereby we are supported by council tax and business rates alone, but that has come nowhere near to replacing what has been taken out of the system, and that's a massive challenge for us. And consider this as well, whenever the government has thrown us very limited lifelines with regard to adult social care precepts, for instance, over the last couple of years, it's come nowhere close to replacing what local government has lost. And in terms of police funding, just as at the moment the government is saying, well, police commissioners will be able to raise some additional finance. In London, if the mayor takes as much as he possibly can, that would equate to £49 million. That's £49 million as against the £650 million which he has lost. So, even now, the government is not replacing our funding streams. And it is so important, that whole issue of financial devolution, financial independence is critical. You don't need me to tell you, London is a city which has a population which is greater than both Scotland and Wales combined. And whilst we have some freedom and flexibility in terms of how we manage our finances, we don't have the freedoms and flexibilities which Scotland as a nation has. And that's quite critical when we think about the challenges we face in a city like ours with infrastructure, for instance, where we're unable to make decisions really as a city about what our infrastructure priorities are or how we deliver them. And that is something clearly that needs to be addressed. I was interested hearing, listening to what Susan was saying, because I think there is we drive, don't we? Regeneration has come out as one of the top concerns, and housing has come out as clearly one of the top concerns of leaders in the survey, unsurprisingly. And again, we know the housing challenge in London is massive. But there is a risk through regeneration. I've spoken about this before. There's always a risk of successful growth and successful regeneration, because in doing everything you can to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past and building estates which become sink estates and problem areas of your city, you create areas where everyone wants to live. and you drive up the desire of people to want to move in, and you drive up house prices, it's a real conundrum. It's not one that we have cracked, but it leads, I think, to some completely unintended consequences that we then as city leaders have to deal with. And the greatest of those at the present time that we all face is the delivery of genuinely affordable housing. Now, again, working with the mayor boroughs in London are trying to respond to that. The mayor has made funding available for effectively 100,000 new council homes over the coming years. And in Southwark we have our own ambition to build council housing. Is it 100,000 or 10,000? It's £100 million anyways, that the mayor has made available. Well, I know you like that way. It's a basic figure. You should know that. But you know, I suppose the point I was going to make on that is that even that level of investment is not going to answer the challenge that we have to deliver genuinely affordable housing right across our city. And even where you have a council which is ambitious, and clearly ambitious like my own to deliver housing, we've got plans to build 11,000 new council homes over the next 26 years. You know, that is but a drop in the ocean of what we actually need. Set aside the challenge of finding the contractors and workforce in post-Brexit Britain that we will need to deliver that housing. So real challenge on housing. There are things we can do. There are things that we can do in terms of, you know, trying to find our own solutions for housing, for tackling the skills gap, and I think it's great devolution from Whitehall to City Hall and the town halls is having an impact, which is good news. And there are little things like this, because a key element of Susan's speech talked about, you know, the softer side of regeneration and how Glasgow are seeking to tackle that, and it absolutely echoes again one of the themes that we have in my own borough of Southwark, where we are talking about, and it's really clunky, but social regeneration, which goes hand in hand with the physical regeneration that we are seeing in our borough. And what does social regeneration mean? It means about tackling some of those inherent health inequalities that we see, where the life expectancy, or the healthy life expectancy of people living in Southwark is a year or two less than the national average. Now that's unacceptable, absolutely unacceptable. What can we do to tackle that? And how can investment into our communities make a difference? How can we use that investment coming in for physical change to create the jobs that we want to see? And you know, we are doing things through our construction skills centre and higher apprenticeship centre. One thing I should mention absolutely is going back to funding again, because this is so critical to us. London as a whole, our growing city, although that growth has slowed down through Brexit, there is a massive challenge for us, because in the last decade our population has grown by 900,000 residents. Government funding in respect of those 900,000 has not followed. So despite the ONS telling us there are 900,000 more citizens in London, we are funded for only 400,000 of those. So it's 500,000 people living in our city for whom the government gives us no grant and no funding support, and that is a massive problem. And so why am I saying this? I'm saying it because whilst we have many challenges which are absolutely identical to the ones that Susan's described in Glasgow, to the ones that you'd find in Manchester or Leeds or Birmingham or any other city in our country, London does have some very special challenges and unique financial challenges. It's not just our growing population, it's the number of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children who are in our city. It's the number of people who rely on councils through no recourse to public funds for financial support. It's the amount that we spend on temporary accommodation in London for our residents. It's the number of young people who have special educational needs, who are a growing cost and challenge to our finances. So, Andrew, well, in kind of wrapping up, I mean, I think that the survey is fascinating because it identifies so many common issues that cities and city leaders face. It's fascinating and timely, because it's really important that city leaders do speak with one voice at these incredibly challenging financial times when, as Susan said, austerity clearly has not ended and needs to end for our residents to truly benefit. It's important we speak with one voice. It's important we recognise London has unique challenges. Although it sometimes feels when you're in places like this that the streets are paved with gold, you know, come over so that I'll show you places that are not as spick and span, and there are the risks of successful growth. So some really interesting challenges, a really interesting survey, Andrew. I think it'll be interesting to follow this through on an annual basis to see, you know, how things change and how we overcome some of the issues and challenges that face us. But thank you, Arup, and thank you, Centre for Cities, for doing this work, because at least it brought Susan and I together, listening to each other about the problems that we jointly face in our cities, and it's always good when city leaders talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter, and indeed Susan. Our intention is to continue this on, in the sense, both the conversations from this very first survey, but actually in 12 months' time to repeat this survey and to see how things evolve and change over time. So you read our minds on that, and we need no encouragement to do that. That concludes the formal proceedings. I'd like to thank Arup for brilliantly working with us, Joanna and her team, Zach and Siri towards the back, who worked with our team in both undertaking the survey and then trying to figure out what it all means. So thanks to Arup for working with us on that. Obviously thanks to Susan and Peter for sharing their thoughts on some differences, but actually reminding us that there are lots in common when we look across our urban areas across the country in the UK. And obviously thank you all for coming. You know, I think that, you know, the recognition of the importance of cities, not just to their own places, but actually to the country at large, is not a case that has been won. In a sense, we have to remake over and over and over again the special nature of our cities and what they do, not only for the people that live in them or work in them, but actually what they do for the country at large. And I think even more so, we would be making this point at any moment in time, but particularly in this moment in time when we think about what the future is for this country, reminding our national politicians that are our cities that are driving the economy, creating the great jobs, encouraging the innovation, bringing people who are outside of the labour market back in. It's our cities that are the drivers of the things that we want to see. And they are special at doing that, and we need to give them much greater recognition than maybe we have in the past. So I urge you to take, you know, what you see in the report, but actually take more generally this notion of the urban voice, and make sure that in the conversations that you're involved in the weeks and months and even the years ahead, that you're placing the urban perspective and the urban voice very squarely in some of those conversations. So thank you all for coming. Please stay and carry on the conversations. And if I don't see you before the Christmas break, please have a great, fantastic festive period. And we look forward to carrying on this agenda in 2019. Thank you very much indeed.
Susan Aiken, leader of Glasgow City Council. I think how strongly it came through that the shared priorities of cities really are shared priorities, that city leaders have so much in common, and that the things that we want to do to improve communities, improve the lives of our citizens are they're very similar across different cities. Although we're enormously diverse, we know what our priorities are, we know what our investment needs to be, and we know what results we want to get out of that investment. I think the more cities learn from each other, the better. We can always share, even when there are differences. We are enormously diverse. There are only 7 cities in Scotland, but we're incredibly diverse even in Scotland. But we still have an enormous amount that we can learn from each other. The more we do that, the more an urban agenda can be advanced across the nations of the UK.
Okay, my name's Peter John. I'm the leader of Southwark Council and the chair of London Councils. Well, I think the report has underlined how the case for cities still needs to be made. And actually, even though cities are so divergent, leaders of cities share many common concerns and many common challenges. And I think it's just underlining the commonality of those challenges which has been most interesting. Sometimes, people have the impression that London, the streets are paved with gold, but actually we face many of the same challenges that, Manchester or Birmingham or Glasgow or Cardiff, any city in the UK face. And so it's really important that leaders talk, they share their thoughts and their challenges, and make the case to government.